Rated R.
The movies, anything you want to know about aliens that I have an opinion on.
So
this is it.
A good starting point would be just, where do you come at the franchise from? Did you actually see the movies theatrically? Did you come in from the very beginning? What is your background with Alien?
It's really too bad because I've listened to every show, and most of your guests, if not all, have a very defined origin story with aliens. You know, it was formative for them. For me, I don't think it was. I mean, I have like very vague memories of certain things. The first time I ever heard of Alien, the first one, was in primary school. So I 79, right? Probably around 9 or 10 years old, probably. Something like that. Somebody was talking about it in class. So we're way too young for this. They'd seen it, probably edited down on TV. Maybe they had some sort of movie channel. I don't know. But they were discussing how gross and disgusting and creepy and whatever. You know, they were making it out to be something. I was not at the age where I would have been able to see that at all. I do remember that conversation, though. And then, when did I ever see Alien? When did I see Aliens? At some point, probably in my teenage years. I don't have like a strong memory. My first real memory of any of these movies, the first two ones, are Mad Magazine parodies. Like, I consumed a lot of movies from the 70s, early 80s, or that I did not have access to at the cinema through Mad Magazine. I feel like many of the movies that I've seen later, I read them as jokes. I do remember those particular parodies, though. So that was probably my first contact. The first Alien that I ever saw in theaters was Alien 3. So by that time, I'm at university, and I know that before we went to see, like in the ramp up to the movie, which also contains this miniseries that we're going to talk about, is also in the ramp up to Alien 3. We rented the Alien and Aliens and watched it. I say we, like myself and my girlfriend at the time. And she was really stoked for the third movie and did not like it. But we did watch those two movies, and I don't think it was the first time I ever saw them. It was like, okay, let's recap it for us. It was not a first watch. So sometime between 1993, Alien 3, and prior to that, somewhere in my teenage years, I must have seen them. Probably on television, possibly rented. I don't know. See, I wish my memory was less vague.
That's the thing, though. I like different perspectives, different experiences with the stuff. Not everybody is going to be like a die-hard fan or anything. Now, did you progress past Alien 3, or did you have a similar reaction to your girlfriend at the time and be like, okay, this is my stopping point, this is where I quit this thing?
I think I liked Alien 3 certainly more than she did. I understand why she didn't. I mean, it was very bleak and dark and rapey. It's not a feel-good movie by any means, especially if you've just come off Aliens, then that movie is kind of more triumphant. It's not that it's not dark, but, you know, it ends on a happier note, let's say, than Alien 3. I liked it well enough. I enjoyed the elements of it. I do think the director's cut that eventually came out is better, although I prefer an alien coming out of a dog than the cow. But the rest of it, restoring, Paul McGann doesn't disappear in the middle of the film. You know, it's more consequent. So I probably like the director's cut better, which is still to say that it's one of the weaker ones overall because it is a mess. Not necessarily due to, you know, it's not Fincher's fault necessarily. It's just a mess from top to bottom because of studio interference mostly. I saw all the other ones, including the Predator ones, but at different time. The Joss Whedon one, whatever it's called. That one I thought sucked. I never revisited it. I didn't see it in theaters or anything. It was just like I eventually saw it. I knew of its reputation. And when I saw it, I was like, yeah, it's true. It's not good. And then Prometheus and Covenant. I thought Covenant was pretty good, actually. I'd say Covenant is the best alien film since Aliens. But at the same time, I don't think we need to go back and get an origin story for this biology. And why can't the xenomorphs have existed, evolved normally? We don't need that origin story that also has humans and synthetics in it. We don't need all of that, I don't think. But given that we do have them, I thought Covenant was pretty good. Prometheus, pretty forgettable. And then the ones with the Predators, I think the one by Paul Anderson is kind of fun. The one with the pyramid and that has a lot of elements from the Dark Horse comics. Bit of fluff. But then the other one, it's all like dark and grainy and you don't see anything. And that one's terrible. That one's gore porn and is the worst of anything that has been filmed with the aliens in it.
It's difficult to prove a negative, almost impossible, one would say. But knowing that there's such a strong fandom for aliens and the expanded universe, the Predators, all that kind of good stuff, you are a very casual fan from the sounds of it. Is there a specific thing that you can think of that makes it to where you have remained a casual fan that you find kind of distancing or off-putting about the franchise? Or it just doesn't grab you the way other franchises do?
Personally, Alien is very close to a masterpiece. That first one, I think, is amazing. And then Aliens is a fun adventure movie. You know, James Cameron's a bit overrated to me, but it's a good sci-fi action movie. And from then on, it's a little bit like what Star Wars used to be, where people were all raving about Star Wars and their Star Wars fandom, but hated most of the movies. Like, I'm a big Star Wars fan, but there's only 1.5 good movies in there. You know, that was sort of their take. So I feel it's a little bit true with Aliens. I'm not saying it's true with Star Wars necessarily, but with Aliens, it's really kind of true. So you got 2 good movies, 2 excellent movies even. And that's enough to have a fandom going and that like spark people's imaginations. I saw them a little later than people normally did, I think. So at that point, it's like, well, I really respect these movies. I really think they're good. But everything that's come after has been just okay or problematic or terrible. So it's hard to keep a fandom going, which is, I think, is the importance of the comics and other media, because if you're not finding the right vibe from the few movies that you get, and there have been like long gaps, obviously, after the first 2, 3 sequels, whatever, you need to feed the beast in some other way. Now, I did buy some comics, but to me, tie-in comics, I never really got into that stuff. I wasn't reading the Star Wars comics. I didn't read like the Indiana Jones comics. And then when I got to a comic book store, that era, I got some tie-in comics. Not that much. I think I preferred original, quote unquote, original characters or concept. It's not that I'm not a fan of Aliens. It's just I'm not a fan of the franchise necessarily, or the Predator ones for that matter. So I like the first 2 movies. I think they're excellent. And then not everything needs to be a franchise.
Speaking of tie-in comics, that's something that we'll have to address before we even dive into the book we're doing this time. Have you ever read Cyberantics: A Little Adventure?
No, I did not have It's too bad, because I remember buying a lot of Rick Geary books in the 90s. I quite liked his art style, Classics Illustrated and whatever else, but I don't think I saw it on the stands, perhaps. Ties into what we're going to talk about.
Right, and so I wanted to give a little background on that, since it works essentially as a prequel to the main story. And I'm just going to read directly from the Dark Horse website. Cyberantics is presented in a hardcover illustrated children's book format. Publication date March 1st, 1992. The project includes specific information that is intrinsically tied to many of the events found in the Aliens Hive series. The ant featured as the main character in Cyberantics is also a character in Aliens Hive. The 2 stories interrelate, and by reading both Cyberantics and Aliens Hive, the reader's understanding of the concepts in both stories is deepened. However, both this book and the comic series can be read and enjoyed on their own. Science fiction horror, 1495, age range 8. The book was 11 inches by 8 inches, 56 pages, black and white with red highlights. Cyberantics features comments on the text and a biography of the author, another character in Hive, as well as an ersatz bibliography. It's supposedly written by Stanislaw Mayakovsky, but it's really Jerry Prosser. There's a reference to the creators being the Gear. This book apparently gets a mention in the 1994 Stronghold miniseries as well. It's never been collected, never been reprinted. I spent good money on the Marvel collection of the second volume, first volume. You would think that it would be, since it's never been reprinted, you'd think that would be one of those value-added things, but apparently they forgot it existed, or there's something preventing them from reprinting it. I'm going to read a little bit from Mark Fraunfelder's newsletter, The Magnet. He states that Cyberantics looks like a kid's picture book, but it was meant for older readers. The page margins include notes about ant behavior from evolutionary biologist and ant expert Bert Holdobler and sociobiologist E.O. Wilson. Strikingly designed in the style of Russian constructivism artist Alexander Rodchenko, Cybernetics tells the story of Mayakovsky's cybernetic ant, Ari, Japanese for ant, as she joins a colony of wild ants and becomes its protector. I was unable to read this. I didn't go through the trouble of buying a copy. I'm not going to say it's pricey, but $36 on Amazon, and that's one of the only places that had it available. I tried some of the big comic book online shops. They didn't have any copies. It doesn't look like my cuppa. I just didn't feel compelled to read it, but I'll feature a little bit of the art that I pulled out of that newsletter in our Tumblr if somebody wants to get a look at Rick Geary's work, and you should just be aware that that would inform a reading of this comic book.
It was totally my jam, too. It's an artist I like. I like these kinds of one-shot, almost documentary in a way. I read a lot of documentary comics at the time, so probably just I didn't notice it. It was under-ordered, maybe. I don't know, but I don't remember ever seeing it.
It would make sense for it to be under-ordered for a variety of reasons, but let me talk a little bit about the publication, specifically of Aliens Hive #1. It was released supposedly on February 4th, 1992, according to Mike's World of Comics. We'll address a little bit something about that later on. The same month, you saw the release of John Byrne's X-Men #0, Young Indiana Jones Chronicles #1, Star Wars Dark Empire #2. The issue was ranked as the 20th top-selling title for the month by by Diamond Comic Distributors. By the way, issue number 2 was released supposedly on March 17th, 1992. That ranked 34th in the top 100. Number 3 was supposed to be released on April 21st, 1992. That was ranked 36th. And if you're minding the dates, you'll notice that every issue loses a week. And then according to Mike's, all of a sudden, May 5th, 1992 is the release date of issue number 4. But if you dig deeper into Mike's site, he, I think, prefers the multiple sources. He'll go with multi-source dating as opposed to most likely source. If you go into the site, you can see that most probably was actually released on May the 20th. But since that was an outlier and all the other dates say the 5th, he went with the 5th. I'm pretty confident that it was the 20th. I don't think the book suddenly came out ahead of schedule. And based on the numbers I've been able to see, the book probably sold in the high 5-figure range, roughly 70,000 copies an issue, more give or take. It would be easy for Cyberantics to get lost in the shuffle because other books published concurrently with the Aliens Hive miniseries include Aliens Newt's Tale, Aliens Tribes hardcover, the Creepy Limited series, the Dark Horse Presents Alien Special, which was another book that I bought off the stands as opposed to something I picked up down the line. Dark Horse Presents offered the final chapters of the Sin City serial. Deadline USA was out, The Eyeball Kid, Hard Boiled, Hard Looks, Martial Law Super Babylon, which was the finale of a story begun at the UK publisher Apocalypse before it fell apart, RoboCop vs. the Terminator, Tales of Ordinary Madness, that's an early Mike Allred work, Terminator, Hunters and Killers, The Thing from Another World miniseries adaptation, and Vampirella, Morning in America. So there was a lot going on at Dark Horse and in comics in general at this point in time. Now, I understand this was probably one of the periods where you were the most rabid about collecting comics. Were any of those titles something that were in your pool box?
I don't know. I don't think I recognized, except the Dark Horse Presents. I checked to see if maybe there was some earlier Alien stuff that I might have read before Hive. You know, like, is Hive my first Aliens comic? And I think it is because I started reading Dark Horse Presents when John Byrne started doing Next Men in it. That's what attracted me to it. And we were right in the middle of that first Sin City story. I kept picking it up for probably, like, that was like the late 40s in numbering. And I got through to number 100 and a little past, I think, before I stopped reading it. Dark Horse, it was already on my radar as the people who did the tie-ins. You know, that was clear from the shelving that they did a lot of tie-in books. And I wasn't really reading any tie-in books. What drew me to Hive was essentially Kelley Jones, who I knew from, by then, Batman and Dracula, probably the first Deadman miniseries, Sandman. These were actually books that I'd read, and I liked the art style, and that's why I picked up Hive. Not necessarily because of the aliens, but like you said, this was a period where I was not a rabid collector, a rabid trier of things, which I'd always also been when I was a kid, but back then, you know, you didn't have a comic book store. So now, early 90s, I have access to a comic book store. I'm buying everything. I'm trying everything, tasting everything. I remember actually thinking, maybe this is an open door to the Aliens comics because they seem to be very popular and they, you know, there are a lot of them being announced. So I'm going to pick this up. There's a new movie coming out soon. I'm going to pick this up and maybe I'm going to pick up all of them from now on or something. Do remember picking up, I think it's a prestige format called Sacrifice. I think that's the name of it. I don't think I picked up Newt's Tale, though I remember seeing it. I only have like a certain amount of money. So anything I want to pick up on a permanent basis, well, that takes away from the taste test money. A lot of stuff was tried and didn't survive.
Since you touched on Kelley Jones as being one of your motivating factors, let's get a little bit into the background on him. Of all places, he managed to get his start at Marvel Comics. He apparently was going to college at the same time he was drawing books for Marvel. He became a pro in 1984, working on, I think, the last issue of the original Micronauts series, and then he went on to draw most of the 2-year run of the New Voyages. Did you ever pick that one up?
I don't think so, no. I dropped out of Marvel entirely. As soon as I got to a comic book store, that was the last year I bought any Marvel for a long time.
I definitely bought the first issue of that book, and it was one of my introductions to body horror, certainly my introduction to Kelley Jones, and I liked the art, but it was a little too weird for me at that age. I was a little freaked out by it, and the story didn't grab me as much as I would have liked. Peter B. Gillis, I think, wrote that, and while I liked his work, it certainly more so a few years down the line, I think it was a little bit too sophisticated for me at that point in time. It was weird going through these Hive issues because every now and again, I would see that Michael Golden influence that I could see why somebody would go, well, this is the guy who just succeeded Michael Golden on Micronauts, but he went into such a Bernie Wrightson place as things progressed, you can easily miss that element, but you can see it much more in those early issues.
You know where I actually saw Kelley Jones for the first time? Didn't he do the Micronauts X-Men miniseries?
Possibly. say. But I thought, no, Paul Smith did Alpha Flight. I want to say it was Butch Geist that did the miniseries, the Micronauts X-Men miniseries. I want to say it was Butch Geist, who also kind of had a Michael Golden-y kind of thing going on in his earlier years.
Yeah.
So anyway, after New Voyages ended, he worked on various short-lived indie projects, and I mean short, like an issue here, 2 issues there. He did the Comet Man miniseries for Marvel in 1987, which I believe was Miguel Ferrer and the kid from Lost in Space co-wrote that. And then he just was in the hell of licensed product. He did the Air Raiders series for as long as that ran. He did Dino Riders, and he always got these funky inkers like Jerry Teleok. He got Danny Bolandi. I guess he was mostly getting these Filipino inkers. And based on comments he's made in interviews, my suspicion is, given that he came into Marvel during the Jim Shooter era, I think they were trying to hammer him into that mold, that Bronze Age ideal mold, by throwing these inkers at him. They were going to make him normal looking, made everything kind of a weird mush. And I'm assuming you didn't probably pick up any of that material.
No, I don't think so. But yeah, Jerry Telelock was, I'm not pronouncing it correctly either, also destroyed Mike Mignola on Alpha Flight. That was a very, very heavy kind of inking, like really transformed the pencils, I think. If Kelley Jones got hit with that kind of stuff, it would have been unrecognizable.
And I had this weird attraction to Danny Bolandi's stuff. Always drawn to his work. I really liked his inks over David Mazzucchelli on Daredevil before Mazzucchelli became what he was going to become. Another instance of a guy who starts out reasonably mainstream and in the mold, and then very much breaks that mold as he goes forward. But it just was not a good combination. Kelley Jones had always wanted to draw. He actually ended up dropping out of college because he was trying to go to college and draw comics at the same time, and was getting like 3 or 4 hours sleep a night at most, and he could only do that for so many years before he finally gave up on that. And again, for years he tried to be the artist they wanted him to be, and then finally something clicked, starting with the Dead Man strip, which he did with Mike Baron in Action Comics Weekly. Apparently he worked on it in secret. They gave him the assignment, they gave him a 1-year deadline, I think it was, and just like he kind of went off on it, and I think they thought that he'd taken the money or run on something, but eventually he just dumped 40 pages of the project onto them, and he made it so that they would have no ability to edit it, essentially. He wanted to make it as metal-proof as possible. DC was much more open to his work than Marvel had been. They loved it. He was a guy that nobody paid attention to before then, but starting with Dead Man, people actually were like, hey, who is this guy? And started asking for him and started to ask to work on him. He goes from Dead Man and several projects, you mentioned several of them, the Batman Red Rain, I think it was called, and Dead Man Love After Death. Then he goes into the Sandman, and he would refute this. I feel like that's kind of when he started to really start getting people's attention, starting with Dead Man and then into Sandman, because he seemed to be the thing that took Sandman to the next level. Like Mike Dringenberg, I thought he was great on The Doll's House. It was definitely a cult hit, but it felt like Season of the Mists, and that the imagery that Kelley Jones produced that started popping up on t-shirts and posters, that seemed to not only give him traction, but I think the Sandman traction as well.
Sure, I'm not going to dispute that. It all depends where you personally saw him first, and that's going to color your opinion. Even his own opinion is whatever he did that got him all those jobs, and I think he could credit work prior to Sandman to say, well, if I hadn't done that work, then Neil Gaiman wouldn't have asked for me by name or something.
Well, one thing he did mention in interviews was that they asked him to stay on, that they wanted him to be the series regular going forward. And I could have sworn I heard a story where they basically, I think they pushed Dringenberg off of the book. That might have had something to do with that, as well as they might have tried to better deal the artist, essentially. But that Kelley Jones, especially as he's starting to come into himself and maybe feel himself a little bit, he always wants to collaborate on his projects, apparently. And Neil Gaiman's a full script guy, and so he didn't really get to give much to the book. And I think he was just wanted to something where he could make more of a contribution.
Yeah, eventually Neil Gaiman was, and this is from the Sandman Companion, but eventually Neil Gaiman was asking for artists like this. Okay, this story, it's going to have this feel. I would like to work with such and such an artist, or sometimes I want to work with such and such an artist. Here's a story that would fit their style. So he was matching stories to style, or vice versa. There's a little more of a give and take with the artist when you're doing something like that. But I haven't heard any of the stories about pushing people out or whatever.
And some of that supposition on my part, I have misheard things. I don't give it too much credence. I didn't research that enough to try to back up my bullshit. So having talked about Kelley Jones, we can talk a little bit about Jerry Prosser, the writer of the story. He's mostly known as an editor who just dabbled in scripting. He was at Dark Horse from the earliest days and stayed with them forever, it seemed like. In 1988, he took over scripting duties on the Mark series from Randy Stradley. Then he did some new backups in a 1989 Space Hawk reprint miniseries, the old Basil Overton stuff. He came back to do a Mark strip for Mayhem number 1 through 4. In 1993, he did the Predator Race War miniseries. Then he did the Steel Harbor miniseries as part of Dark Horse's Comics Greatest World, where they were trying to expand into superhero universes. He did an X strip for Dark Horse Comics. He did the Predator Invaders from the Fourth Dimension, as well as the Will to Power miniseries in 1994. Will to Power was one of those efforts of Dark Horse to try to get their Comics Greatest World some traction, but it always seemed to struggle. The majority of the concepts, there were only a few that really seemed to have a fandom, essentially. And then he moved over to Vertigo for a little bit. He produced the miniseries Skin Graft, The Adventures of a Tattooed Man for Vertigo. Yep. He did the last 10 issues of the Animal Man series in 1995. Then he went over to Acclaim and he wrote Eternal Warrior, Fist and Steel, as well as a few Magic the Gathering specials and miniseries. And just in general, he's done a lot of adaptations for writers such as Andrew Vox, Bram Stoker, and Joe R. Lansdale. Hasn't written a lot of stuff in 20 some odd years now. It seems like the 90s was sort of his last hurrah. Any experience with Jerry Prosser or any of those books?
Well, I read the Vertigo ones because I was buying all of Vertigo at that point. So I remember the Tattooed Man miniseries. Well, I say remember. I barely remember any of his work there. So that tells you something. And he was sort of hired to kill and bury the Animal Man series, I guess. 10 issues, maybe, he didn't go into it knowing that it would be canceled, but he was driving towards what would be a final ending. By that point, Animal Man was so different from its beginnings. It was like a completely different tone, look, everything, that we were sort of happy to see it go.
And being an Animal Man guy, given that your internet identity is tied specifically to Animal Man,
yes.
Are you in the school of people who's like Grant Morrison should have just ended that series, or were you interested in some of the things that came afterwards? Because like you said, it gets very different pretty quickly.
I'd be a hypocrite, as someone who runs a show called Who's Editing, where we reinvent characters. I'd be a hypocrite to say that I think series should end. Like a character like that. I think the way it ends, it's a perfectly good ending. I mean, Grant Morrison's. And then other people are going to tell their own stories as that ending says will happen, in fact. So it has to happen. I think like a Peter Milligan little short there was interesting. It had like the proper weirdness. I don't think it had the same feeling. And then, I read the whole thing. I don't like the bit, like once it goes Vertigo, we get away from superheroes, all the stuff with the red Animal Man with long white hair. And it's like, what is this? You never know when a take is going to be good or redefine a character in a great way. So you can't say series should end and then it's over and we don't want to see that character anymore. Not if the character is pre-existent, like Animal Man. Like if it's your baby, and like Sandman, for example, that was Neil Gaiman's baby. The IP was DC's, but really he created that character and that cast of characters. He brought in some things from DC's legacy. It's still his. And when he says, well, I'm going to end it and I'm going to end it definitively and nobody else is going to pick it up. And for a while, there was plans for it to be picked up by others, but cooler heads prevailed, I guess. That has an ending. Great. Animal Man, you can say that that's in every run on a character by a different author. It has a beginning and an end, possibly, or it might be part of that huge soap opera like Spider-Man, especially in this world now where we're trade waiting and there are a lot of runs. And now they very often restart with a new number one all the time. Just to say that there was an ending and that there's a new beginning, and we can take them as volumes in that sense. No, I'm not going to say Animal Man should have ended. It did end that run, and then there are other runs, and maybe you're going to strike gold again, and maybe not, and mostly not in this case.
And I will say the only time I followed Animal Man on a monthly basis was during one of those follow-up runs that are under-heralded or unheralded. I've always loved the Brian Bolland covers, and that was the main draw for me, is that just the story that was invoked by that image made me want to read the comic books. And then when I'd pick it up, it usually didn't match up or wasn't as strong, but I also didn't read the Grant Morrison stuff. The only run I did pick up was when Steve Pugh was drawing, I think it was Jamie Delano's scripts. And for me, that was the only time where the art was as strong as those covers. And they were much more in a horror place during that run. I think that was the very earliest days of the Vertigo transition.
Yeah.
But
when Vertigo hit, it was Jamie Delano picking it up.
And I only lasted as long as Steve Pugh was doing it. And then once he wasn't there anymore, that was pretty much my draw there. I'll just cop to that. That's the summation of what I have to say about the Animal series, to be honest. So I guess we can go ahead and get into the comic book itself, the book at hand.
My synopsis would be like almost a 3-liner. So you go ahead and
no worries.
We'll get it.
The story opens up with a character who is eventually revealed to be Julian Lish, a woman with a scar across her right eye and cheek, as well as a nose ring. And she's running around inside of a space station. She is being pursued by an alien. We eventually find out that this is not actually an alien drone, but a synthetic XL1. She calls it Norbert. It's been created by a scientist named Dr. Stanislaw Mayakovsky, which is a pretty distinctive name, so you probably remember it from earlier. This is the same gentleman who wrote the Cyberantics book, which is existent inside the universe. Essentially, this guy helped to create this cybernetic ant that went into an ant colony to, basically dupe things out to see if the pheromones that were concocted by scientists would be able to fool the ants, and tells a story that's very similar to the story that ultimately gets told in Alien's Hive. And because of the research he had done, he had attracted Julian Lish because she wanted to create a synthetic alien that would be able to rob a hive to get royal jelly, which, as established in previous miniseries, is a highly valuable commodity, specifically for Xenozip. It's been mass-produced, but also, of course, if you get the raw stuff, even better. Now, the Doctor has a particular interest in this stuff because he's dying from cancer, and apparently not only does the raw royal jelly ease his pain, but also it induces a state where he's essentially seeing through all time within his lifetime and can journey within his own timeline to pleasant events and basically draw out his life as long as possible and to some of the most pleasant occurrences as possible so he can enjoy what time he has left, to the utmost. But of course, this stuff isn't legal. It's not readily available. They want you to buy Xenozip or bust. So he's having to go into the black market. He's basically eating up all of his finances to get a hold of this stuff as best he can. So when Julian Lish shows up, she is she's a con artist. She's an opportunist, she's a thief, and so she suggests, well, why don't we go to where some aliens are and we'll steal some royal jelly using a synthetic alien. And so them, and I assume a team of designers, end up putting together Norbert, as she calls it, and they train this robot in part with Mac the dog, which is this cute little, I don't know the breed. Do you know dogs?
Not much, no.
Yeah, it's one of those floppy-eared brown dogs. Somebody who knows this stuff can chime in later on down the line. So anyway, the robot plays fetch with the dog, and it's a cute little bonding thing going on. Everybody gets together to go after the royal jelly, including the little robot that was created, the A7RE, as mentioned earlier. Apparently, Julian found out about how to get to some royal jelly from a dying bio-national executive, probably a similar situation to what's going on with Stan. And she manages to basically seduce Stan. They work together for enough time to create the robot. They put together a team. They get a hold of a ship called the Dolomite, and they travel to the planet A6454. I did not go back and do research, but the assumption I'm working under, this is probably the exact same planet I was seen in Genocide, because a lot of the plot seems straight from Genocide.
Yeah.
So anyhow, go ahead.
Yeah, it's mentioned in the letters page. Somebody remarks on it in issue 4 about whatever. There is a mention of this being like the same company that was in Genocide. Who played the antagonist too.
Yeah, and going into these miniseries, I really thought that they were going to lose the continuity after that initial trilogy with Newton Hicks or whatever you want to call them. But clearly, there is a new continuity that seems to be springing out of those later books, where you don't have the characters showing up necessarily, but you have a lot of the concepts and corporations reintroduced. We have a sequence where they're gathering a crew to man the Dolomite ship. By the way, you do catch the Dolomite reference, I'm certain.
Yeah, it's a strange thing to name a ship.
Mm-hmm. After a blaxploitation character.
Yeah, I mean, how did that survive to become, I don't know.
How do they even know what a Dolomite is at that point in time?
Yeah, bizarre.
So they're gathering a crew, and they're demonstrating the XL1, and it's playing with Mac the dog, fetch. And then, because apparently it's still in predator mode, even though it's shown to be playing with the dog in corridors around people, the people who are gathered naturally run in fear from the alien that has presented itself. It freaks the alien out, and he proceeds to kill several of them. It's a sequence that, to my mind, makes no sense that you would have this active alien running around killing people. I think it was just an excuse for Kelley Jones to draw intestines, brains coming out of people's skulls, but they're really good viscera, so I really can't complain about the visuals in that particular sequence.
Yeah, the alien is still acting. It's a fake, but it's still programmed to act like an alien so that it won't be caught out, and then it can lose control. Yeah. So it's got a little bit of autonomy in the same way that Bishop or the other synthetics that we've seen have a certain autonomy, even though they're human in their case. But
which we're going to get into a little bit too. But he also has sort of like a Manchurian trigger where you can shut him down or to make him more like a synthetic that actually talks, which is very peculiar when you see the alien talking with this little square rectangular, not balloons, but it's dialogues rectangles. But we do have a synthetic in the book named Gil, and there's also a human named Hoban. I don't think we ever actually see Hoban at any point in the miniseries. He's just referenced on vid screens vaguely. But Gil is going to be throughout the miniseries, and the first issue comes to an abrupt end, where basically it's them getting to the outskirts of the planet, and you see some aliens on the planet, and then it just sort of stops. Given that this was a miniseries I was reading as it was coming out, I really didn't understand why the book just stopped there. It was definitely an early example of writing for the trades. So we get into the second issue, and we have a ship with debris floating through space. So the crew of the Dolomite looks for the black box. They find out that what's happened is that this ship fell prey to Captain Potter of the Lancet. This is apparently a gunship that exists to blow up anybody that comes into the territory of people that are actively harvesting royal jelly from the planet. There's also a sequence in which it feels like Julian is flirting with Gil the synthetic, talking about how his hands resembled her father's hands, how she was somewhat envious of his synthetic nature because of the lack of human extremes of emotion. Very peculiar little sequence, particularly because it doesn't, for the most part, pay off, because Gil at this point is a pure synthetic and is just sort of like, you people kind of bore me, I'm just here to do my job, I'm doing what I'm programmed to do, la-di-da. Cut to Julian meeting back up with Stan, and Stan essentially tells her, whether or not it's a con or not, if you're making any of this up for my benefit, please don't stop. She's making the last time of his life good, and he doesn't want to know that anything different is going on. So they get to the planet, and all the aliens are asleep, and they're like, what's happened here? And apparently they found a way, some sort of frequency that causes the aliens to pass out. It's sort of like smoke with bees. And so the alien and Mac the dog are sent onto the planet to investigate. Being in predator mode, the alien synthetic XL1 kills the beekeepers and allows them to investigate by remote through his eyes and determine the process by which they've been gathering royal jelly. And the intent is for them to just go down, steal the ship, and make off with the loot without having to go through any of the trouble they expected to go through. But because they went through the trouble of building this robot, they want to send it into the Hive, see how it works. One of the ways in which they do that is they've come up with these on humans is a wristband, but on the dog is a collar. And it basically is a box that emits a pheromone that neutralizes the senses of the aliens. Essentially, since aliens don't see you, they smell you and feel the vibrations of you and the like. As long as you're fairly quiet, it'll emit a pheromone that causes the alien to sort of ignore you. And so they test it with a dog. They don't attack the dog while it's active. They deactivate it to see what happens. Sure enough, they kill the dog. So hey, there's a trigger warning I probably should have thrown out there ahead of time. A lot of dog people don't like seeing the doggies get killed. Sorry about that. They send the alien into the Hive, manages to get past the drones fine enough, but once it gets to the mother isn't fooled and basically sends all the drones after the XL1. It appears to be destroyed. That's when things start to go bad. Going into the third issue, the Lancet has attacked the away ship. They've grounded the crew, the main supporting characters, or the main characters of the story that we've been introduced to. It's Gil the synthetic, it's Julie the lady, it's Stan the dude. They're all stuck on the planet. They got to figure out what they're going to do. It's sunset. There's a storm coming. They've got a whole bunch of things working against them. They're either going to die in a storm or get killed by aliens. So the best thing they can come up to do is, since they've already seen roughly the trail in the Hive through Norbert's eyes, they're just going to basically retrace his steps to get to the beekeeper lander to get to the royal jelly. So they activate their bands. The wristbands give them, I think, something like 3 hours of protection. It's going to take them about that long to get into and out of the Hive, so they hope for the best. They start making their way through. We get these moments where we get into the head of Julie, and she makes it fairly clear that this isn't a show for her. She's legitimately emotionally bonded to Stan. She's aware that he's going to die, and she's very angsty about what her life is going to be like once he's gone, because he's kind of the only real thing in her life after presumably a lot of cons, a lot of thefts that have left her unfulfilled. So she's not looking forward to this guy dying. They make their way to the alien midden, and I'm not a science guy, so a midden is basically the shithole, the Sheol, whatever you want to call it, where all the ants, or in this case the aliens, dump all their crap. That's where they find Mac Mac the Dog's remains, and its chest is ripped open, so I have to assume that they had used him for a chest burster. So spoilers for Alien 3, if you didn't already catch that earlier when we were discussing it. They actually run into the XL-1 again. It turns out that Norbert is a little bit better equipped than we had known. Probably would have known this if we'd read Cyberantics, but apparently at one point the A1 ant came across a similar situation. The queen mother of the ant hive is not fooled by the pheromones emitted, sends their drones against the A7, and the A7 turns out to have, I assume, the ant equivalent of a miniaturized cold plasma laser, which Norbert also has. He forms it out of his tail, I think, and he's got sparks coming off of him. He's obviously had a lot of battle damage, but he's going to take some of these aliens with him and essentially act as a security guard for the group on their way out. They figure out that like an ant hive, there are these chimneys within the hive that they bring in a draft. It helps to cool the insides of the hive so the ants don't suffocate in their own pheromones or just from body heat and the like. And so they start making their way out of the hive. And this is about the point where I noticed some more touches of not only Mike Golan's influence, but also just a little bit of Paul Gulacy. The artist likes to talk about how he wants to be a reincarnation of the 70s artist and how he's a culmination of all of those artists and styles, and he doesn't want to be of his time. He wanted to be a guy who worked in the 70s. And Gulacy was also a 70s guy, but not somebody I would necessarily associate with Kelley Jones. That being the case, he does draw some kind of sexy women. You know, they're definitely more of a 50s body type than what Gulacy draws, but I guess that's another area where that would manifest. Finally, Julie gets a taste. She has to fight off an alien. She gets some of the acid blood on her. It does her some damage, as revealed in the narrative, but I don't actually see any battle damage on her figure anywhere, so you just have to take them at their word. The assumption is that this acid blood has done her some pretty severe damage, and that she might also have a ticking time clock on her own life. And she gets a taste of the royal jelly to help deal with her pain, just as Stan has been dealing with his pain. Stan, in fact, has not taken any royal jelly recently because he has to keep his head straight for this particular adventure, although we've seen him trip balls several times over the course of the miniseries. So going into the fourth issue, they've reprogrammed Gil to give him freedom. He no longer is just a drone himself doing what he's been told. He can actually think for himself, feel for himself, and that's when he reveals his own affection for Julie and actually kisses on her a little bit. Stan has to tell him to back off because she's rusting, she's not doing great, this isn't appropriate. So it turns out that this is all the Grant Corporation's fault, that they've blockaded this planet, that anybody who comes near is trespassing on Neo farm property, that the captain of the enemy ship, who is I believe the only character of color in the story, he appears to be African American, he's going to defend to the death this property. They're trying to do their best to address that. Things don't go well for them because not only are they having to deal with the aliens who for some reason they don't smoke out again, they don't make them fall asleep again. I don't know if they lack the technology or what, but they just sort of drop that story point. There also is a cute reference where the scientist talks about how he would hate to see the predator that preyed on aliens to give them that acid blood response, and I think that the fact they use specifically the word predator makes me wonder if that isn't a predator reference. Might have been a little sly thing. There's a mention about in the Cybernetics book, apparently the ant had experienced something called a slave-making formica subintegra. I'm not sure what that reference was about. All I know is that there's another reference to Diogenes and Greek myth. So apparently they introduce a subroutine into the Gil synthetic. He's sent to negotiate with the corporation. Instead, he starts biting off his fingers and then he explodes and apparently kills the captain and his crew. But there are still some guys left on the planet. They've also been using those force walls that we saw in the Jenny Side miniseries, but the aliens do a World War Z movie adaptation thing where they basically start piling up until they're able to scale over these walls. And so they start getting into the enemy ships. There's also some that are getting into the away ship that our people are in. Basically, they've gotten back to the beekeeper ship. I don't know if I mentioned that part. And they barricaded themselves in there, but the aliens are breaking through. So in the final moments, we see Stan giving a final dose of royal jelly to Julie and himself so they can basically be blissed out before they get killed by aliens. He makes a reference to a Japanese figure.
Dokkan was able to become a well-mannered, properly educated samurai who was eventually able to build the foundation for Japan's capital city. He was highly esteemed by his peers and well respected by his master, Sadamasa. Sadly for Dokkan, Sadamasa felt that he was too highly esteemed by his peers and invited Dokkan to his castle under the pretense of having a party. Once the party was over, Dokkan was lying in a nice warm bath that had been prepared for him by Satomasa. Suddenly, one of Satomasa's soldiers broke into the bath and stabbed Dokkan in the chest. While he lay in the tub bleeding to death, he composed his final poem, Kakuru Toki, Sakaso Inouchi no Oshi Karame, Kanate na Kimi to Omoi Shiruzuba. Had I not known that I was dead, I would have mourned the loss of my life.
He gets blissed out and lives through these happy moments and a final moment of lovemaking with Jolie. He's completely in his head by the time he's taken by the aliens, impregnated with a chest burster, and dies by the birth of a new alien. And that's how the miniseries ends. Also somewhat abruptly, as most of the issues had, but you get the gist of it. What was your response to the book as it was coming out, and how did it hold up today?
As it was coming out, I was into it. I mean, I collected all four. Normally, if I didn't like the first issue, that would be the only one I have. So we know that I enjoyed the comic. I do think it doesn't end as well as it begins. It sets up a lot of things that are of interest. Most prominently, I think it asks the question, what if they made an android xenomorph? That whole element, eventually, the robotic alien or the synthetic alien pulls out that gun and defends him, but it's gone by the fourth issue. So it wasn't that story after all. If you're reading also Cyberantics, I guess, it's always relating the ant experience with the alien experience. A similar hive. And so the beekeepers, okay, bees, ants, aliens. I get it. And then so if you send in your infiltrator, what are you going to find out? What similarities are there with ants or whatnot? But it stops there. I mean, it's like we send them in and then it becomes, the comic is a lot like Prometheus. Let's go to the planet. We've got an opportunity to find out more about these aliens. And there's a big storm and then it becomes like a survival movie. It's kind of like that. But I feel like it drops the ball on that core premise that it had at the beginning. And then suddenly we're just trying to survive this planet. And guess what? It's an aliens story. So we don't. And I think that is the weakness of alien stories and the reason that I didn't pursue them. One of the things that drew me to this beyond Kelley Jones art is really, the chance to get a complete story that is not necessarily ultra connected with what had gone before, either the movies or other comics. This is all done in one, done in four, but done in one. So I was interested in that and say, okay, yes, we can tell different types of stories inside the alien universe. It doesn't have to be a retread of the movies, except by the end, it kind of becomes a retread of the movies. So instead of exploring the themes further or to their logical or satisfying end, everybody dies. It left me with, well, does every alien story end with everybody dies? If so, I'm kind of tapping out. I think that was the reaction back then, and it was also the reaction now, where I felt like thematically it had interesting things going. The question of, okay, like fake alien, fake human, or fake person in the form of guilt, fake love, fake euphoria. Is there something about simulacra and reality that is being played with? And then the fake ant, real ant, ants, aliens. Are we creating like mirrors between things and making parallels and contrasts and comparisons? But in the end, it all just falls apart when it just becomes about surviving and then obviously not surviving.
And I've talked about in previous episodes my weird herky-jerky experiences with the Dark Horse comics. You know, I believe the first thing I bought was the second Aliens miniseries. I think the second or third issue as a back issue at a flea market. I believe before I read this miniseries, I had been exposed to at least one issue of Genocide from a friend I had met while I was living out of state. I believe that by the same friend, or maybe through a reprint edition, I had read part of Earth War, but I don't think I'd read the whole thing. So for me, my feeling is that Hive was the first time that I bought an Aliens book, brand new, beginning to end, and it was really my initiation into Aliens comics. And from the very first issue, I was frustrated because it opens mezzanine, where it's just like you're in the middle of everything, and I don't know who these characters are, and I don't know what's going on, and it turns out the alien isn't an alien, but a robot. I'm not sure how quick I was on the uptake of that. I don't know if it started talking in this little rectangular box, if I realized immediately that it was a synthetic or not, but I definitely felt lost. I felt like, these characters, I guess, were in the previous miniseries. I don't know who these people are. I don't know what's going on. There's a lot of references to things like Xenozip, which I know were introduced in Genocide now, but at the time I was like, okay, is this new? Is this a thing that's continuing? They give you flashbacks to the setup of the relationship between the two lead characters. So I'm wondering, okay, are you referencing past comic books, or is this the first time this is being told? The issues would end abruptly. It didn't feel like I got the complete story in any of the issues of the series. I'd also not had any experience with Geary Prosser, the writer, and I found his work very distancing. He uses several different narrative devices through the story. It's relatively linear, but you don't necessarily have one POV character throughout. It jumps around from different perspectives. At some points, it's even like Gil the Synthetic is the lead to some degree for portions of it. There's a lengthy sequence where it's supposed to be quoting directly from Cyberantics, and I did catch on very quickly, especially because I would have read the letters page back then. I didn't read it this time. Them referencing that book and being aware that I don't have this book and feeling like I hadn't done my homework to read the miniseries. And so as a new reader, I was getting irritated by that, but also the fact that since they're quoting from this other book, and it kind of relates to the story I'm reading, but it's still, they're running through the Hive and they're running across resistance, and there's a point where I could be getting excited and getting that adrenaline rush, and instead I'm just in my head reading these passages of text are intended to be like scientific in nature, and so I just don't connect to these characters. And as you mentioned, I'm curious, like, okay, is she a femme fatale, and is that going to be this twist? It's like, no, she really loves the guy and he really loves her. It's almost like the twist is that everybody is on the level for the most part. For me, I think that this miniseries is a tuna sandwich. Tuna on its own doesn't have much in the way of flavor. You don't eat a tuna sandwich to eat the tuna. You eat the tuna sandwich for the condiments, for the garnish, the bread, the cheese, everything but the tuna. The tuna is just a medium for the other stuff that you actually like. If I hated the story, if I outright hated it, I might not have gone that level of detail. But like I said, it was fine. It was okay. A little extra sustenance in their sandwich, basically. I definitely was glad to buy this miniseries, but I was definitely getting it for the Kelley Jones art. I liked his stuff from exposures in books like Grimjack he did a very short run on, and Sandman, and even Micronauts, even though I wasn't aware of the connection back then, but I liked what I'd seen of his work. And I just really think that he is one of the perfect Aliens artists, although I'm sure there are people that he drives insane because his aliens are definitely not on model. He definitely draws Kelley Jones aliens, not, strictly speaking, any previous artists take semblance of that alien, but very much done in his style, and I'm cool with that because I feel like the spirit of the aliens and the spirit of that world is there, and he definitely gives you just this oppressive sense of horror. Graded body horror, even the sexual intimacy we see, he does it in such a way with tongues and people that maybe not the people you want to see getting naked, bumping up against each other and stuff. He seems like he's fucking with you the entire time, and that works, I think, so well for Aliens. I would hardly recommend this miniseries based on the art alone, but I also understand why I didn't go on to read any Geary Prosser stuff, and really why I didn't go on with a lot more Alien stuff after this, because every time I tried, I bought that Dark Horse Presents special. I didn't like the repetitious nature of the stories. As you pointed out, it seemed like every story begins with, here's a bunch of characters that are all going to die horribly. Ryan Daly was talking about in Genocide, how he kept wanting the tycoon to die. Well, at least it's refreshing. At least that's something different from a lot of these stories we keep getting. I'm not rooting for the guy, but at least I didn't know that was the ending that we were going to come up to. This was absolutely the ending I was expecting. I didn't necessarily know they were going to drink royal jelly and bliss out there at the end, but otherwise I pretty much knew where this was going, and so I never invested. So it's all about loving the visuals and loving the world that Kelley Jones is creating. The rest of it is just another Aliens retread. There's nothing there without Kelley Jones. There's nothing there to really latch onto.
True enough. I mean, the term you were looking for earlier is in medias res. I don't think it begins in the middle of things. It just feels like it because we're introduced to the characters a bit later in the story. Kind of find out through dialogue who these people are. And the same way that we find out that xenomorph is not real or, has been created. Because at first you're wondering, okay, well, there's a dog interacting with, like, she's running away from it. It's just a test, but we don't know that. The whole stuff with the dog and the creature is throwing the ball and the dog's playing fetch with a dog. It's just supposed to be very jarring. And I think you're right that it's all about the art in this. And I'm sure it looked great in black and white. I think it looks very nice with the colors as well. They went with like really dark reds or dark turquoise and like strange colors, horror colors, giallo colors. It kind of feels a little bit like we're Mario Brava or something. At the same time, Prosser has this, it makes sense that he went to Vertigo eventually because he's got this, I don't know if he's trying to do the British invasion writers, it's like with text that doesn't actually go with the image, but then you're supposed to relate to the image because it's it's excerpts from the other comic, which is about ants. But this isn't ants, this is aliens, so it's got to be different, but by superimposing a sort of soundtrack or like dialogue, captions over the action, trying to make a sort of play between those two realities as very much a sort of proto-Vertigo kind of thing. It seems all the way through to the beginning, that's going to be a little more, I don't know, uplifted, literary, and then it just devolves into the normal massacre. Well, I say normal, but it still ends on the, ball tripping moment. And so there is an element of, there is a twist to it, or a certain adultness to the material. At the same time, it just doesn't pay off in the way, like the guy really wants to be Alan Moore or Grant Morrison or Peter Milligan or Jimmy Delano. He wants to be one of these guys, but he's faking it. That's how it feels. Whenever you're doing something like that, what it actually comes off as is pretentious, because you're pretending to be something that you're not. I think an Alien story could totally go Vertigo, could totally go Literate, could totally go Alan Moore in the 80s, but this only tries to, but in text it tries to, but in actual plot it doesn't. So that's where it actually fails. But it's still very, very pretty to look at. And I agree that like the aliens can be, Kelley Jones's Batman isn't an anatomically correct Batman either. The cape isn't a physically normal cape either. His dead man looks emaciated. It's like a flying skeleton basically. And nobody else draws it like that. His style is certainly the draw. If you're going to get a Kelley Jones book, you're getting it for that look, because you're not getting it for Grey's Anatomy or whatever. And I think his aliens look cool. His characters look kind of creepy, even when they're not supposed to. I would say that like with any kind of alien story, or like it's fun superheroes, because everybody's got color-coded costumes and stuff. But when you're looking at characters that are just humans in suits and everybody's wearing kind of the same uniform, then it can become confusing if the art is specially stylized, because you're not sure. Like there are parts of this that you have to flip back, because which ship are we on? Which ship are we talking about? Like, the evil corporation or the friendlies, I guess the leads, the protagonists. Sometimes we're looking at the other side, and I'm like confused. Like, who is this? Which ship are we on? Who are we talking to? That kind of happens. And I don't think necessarily like photorealistic art that necessarily helps it, because you can still be very confusing. But I felt like those moments, I wasn't too sure. Like what is striking here though is like, it's alien with dog. Alien playing with dog. And that's like the second cover is exactly that. So it's that jarring juxtaposition of image. And I think that's what Prosser was trying to do in the script as well, by adding those captions. It's like we're juxtaposing this other text, but it doesn't quite work as well as I think he'd hoped.
The colors you mentioned earlier were by Les Dorshad. I agree. I really like the coloring. I will say though that once again, the coloring is distinctly different from the original comic printed and the glossy stock reprints. I don't know if they played with the tint or what, since it's the same colorist, and I don't know that they necessarily recolored it, but it just looks a lot different to me in the computerized version, the digitalized version. Maybe it's got something to do with the glossy stock, but the coloring just works so much better on the original paper, and it really looks different enough that I feel like they must have done something with the tint, the color balance, something that screws it up. I would recommend reading it in the original comics. And yeah, I also agree with you. I do think that this is supposed to be elevated licensed pablum. It's like they're trying, but as you say, like Grant Morrison has done this too, where he tries to do these multimedia projects where you've got to read this book in this order, or specifically it's designed not to be read in a certain order, and you're interacting with it, and you're supposed to touch the page of the comic book to interact with the characters and things like that. And Grant Morrison is either a genius or a nut job, however you view him, but he comes by it honestly. He is what he is, and he can't help himself, and you either go with it or you don't. Where definitely this feels like somebody trying to do something like that and not quite pulling it off. And I'm very frustrated, because I can definitely feel, even though they try to say you don't have to read both, you kind of seem to do, because I really feel like I'm losing something by not reading Cyberantics. It feels like you're being compelled to read this other book that is not Aliens product. But why? This is an Aliens book. Why am I having to read this whole other thing? It's just frustrating to me. I know I'm missing something, or worse yet, I'm not missing something, and it's just I have that feeling because of how it's written. I think that especially if you're a writer with as little, as short of a history, as small of a resume as Prosser's, that was way too ambitious and not the right property to be that ambitious on. I really wish he had just focused on writing this story and not trying to get me to buy another story and have them interrelate with one another. I just feel like I'm missing out on something, but I also suspect, based on what's on the page, like you said, I went for the long version. I gave you a lot of details. We really could have summarized, honestly, go listen to the genocide episode. The 3/4 of that plot synopsis applies to this book as well. It does still feel like Mike Richardson has given these folks marching orders, and they're just going through this formula repetitiously. I'm an Aliens fan. I love the movies. I had already already bought the t-shirt. I'm buying the specials. I want to be here for you, Dark Horse, but hire a writer. Quit having your buddies in Portland write these things. Get somebody from outside. I'm glad you're putting the money into a Sam Keith, a Kelley Jones, so on and so forth, but give me a writer. And they are going to do that. They're going to go for one of the biggest writers they can possibly get soon. So I'm curious to see how that's going to play out as well. But there's a little bit of a not ready for prime time with a lot of this plotting. And I really wish that somebody I thought who knocked out of the park, like Randy Stradley, were doing more of these instead of going round robin with a lot of guys that either need to stay long enough to get some traction and figure out how to tell these stories, or not tell the same story that the other guy just told.
Mm-hmm. I just pulled the digital version to compare because I'm holding the paper version. It really is paler, for one thing. Like these sort of dark grayish blues turn out to be like baby blue, kind of powder blue in the digital version. And there is some recoloring at least, because I just looked at page 22 of the first issue, and I think that's Gil on one of the panels. He looks lime green on the digital. In the original comic, part of his face is green, less olive green, a little more olive, and then the rest of his face is more of a orangey tan or something. So that is a very different color. For the most part, it's just lighter and brighter, but in some instances, it just seems like just not the same color at all. I don't know what's going on there, but I agree. And sometimes it's less colored. You'd have a blue wash on something, and it's white in the digital. So big difference. I would say that the original issues look gorgeous. The digital version, or perhaps it's even like that in the actual print of the reprint, that's just, oh man, even I'm looking at the cover, it's you lose a lot of the mood, a lot of the atmosphere.
And if you look close at some of the pages too, they played around with the trim sometimes. There were a few pages where the color kind of runs off, or the blacks kind of run off, and it looks kind of sloppy, which is fine because this is the kind of book where you want to have that sort of organic sloppiness. And apparently somebody in editorial didn't like that, so they blow up the page and crop it so they cut out those little loose threads. And I realize it's production stuff, and I can see where that would eat away at somebody, but it screws up those pages in the later editions. It just doesn't look right when they blow it up and crop it that way. It's not so bad if you're not familiar with the original, but if you go and you compare the two, it's hard not to favor the original.
Yeah. Well, I think what's most ridiculous about the digital is that the aliens look like they're powder blue. They're much darker and gunmetal almost in the on the original print. So that's an alien color. We know aliens as they're essentially black, so they have to be a darker shade. Here they've got black shading, but they look like they're the same color as your child's bedroom or whatever. So it doesn't quite. I don't think it works as well. It even looks kind of silly. So the format does matter. And I did get that reference to the Predator as well. I had noted that, and especially since the word Predator is in bold, I felt like that was very much supposed to be what kind of predator made this evolve? And they're trying to link the two species because they've been fighting in Dark Horse comics anyway. So we know they're part of that same universe. It wouldn't be true in the movies until the AVP stuff, which arguably is not canon if we trust Prometheus or anything.
So I think we're coming up on the wrap on this one, the daily special. Did you find a page in this book that if you could only have one, that's the one you'd want to have?
Let me look quick. It's not going to be the full page of, with the ant head at the bottom. It's not going to be that. As a pure image, maybe the splash page on the fourth issue, which seems almost oh, we're missing a page. Can you draw some aliens looking boss in the landscape? Because it doesn't really fit the story or anything. If I'm going for one page I kind of liked, I don't know. It's just part of a page at the same time. It's they're not numbered, but in the third issue, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, page 7 or so, where they're climbing this really strange pillar, and they're using the bracelets that shoot out pheromones, and there's an alien slipping by them, not noticing them. I kind of like that page. That was this is an image that I might remember. Either that or something with the alien playing with the dog might be also an interesting thing because it is so jarring and odd. Those are the pages that those are the images that I remembered even all these years. When I picked up again, it's oh yes, that that bit.
Yeah, on one of the trades, they got Dave Dorman to do a shot mostly of the dog, a little bit of the alien. I realized they were going for that sort of juxtaposition there of the cute with the horrific, but it leans too heavily on the cute. The dog just looks adorable, and everything's really brightly lit, and you just kind of don't even see the alien so much. I think that these more horror-centric ones where you introduce a dog into the horror kind of grabs you more. So I very much prefer Kelley Jones's take on that relationship over Dorman's.
Page 8 of the first issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the alien's going after the ball, the dog's just sitting there, and then, it just turns into something else that you weren't expecting. That might be my favorite page.
Yeah, and I remember absolutely when you referenced it, the page where the alien slinks past them. And in particular, you being a cat guy, it reminds me of the way the cats will brush up against your legs or brush up against your body on their way to doing something else. You're just sort of like an obstacle in their way. And that's what that sequence feels like. And it is a surreal moment for anybody who's familiar with the franchise, because you're just not used to the alien walking past somebody and brushing up against them and not paying them any heed. That's just not the way the aliens work. So I definitely remember that page. It was very memorable. As I said, I've really enjoyed a lot of Kelley Jones's work, particularly the early work. I don't classify myself as a Jones fan because a lot of his work is applied to properties that don't resonate for me. I didn't really care for his Dead Man stuff. I'm not into his Batman stuff, which is a substantial portion of his entire catalog.
Yeah.
But I think he just really nails it in this miniseries. And virtually any page here I'd be happy to have. I would, and I'm a picky person, so that says a lot. But at a quick, flipping through the pages, I think the one that I would most prefer to have, I believe it's page 6 in the first issue, and it's a series of shots of the Norbert, the artificial alien, but there are several of those shots that, one in particular, the first one, where it's got a very, very Wrightson vibe to it that works great, especially the coloring emphasizes that. There's also one panel in the midst of that where you see the female character in shadow mostly. You get a little bit of her nose, a little bit of her brow, her hair's in her face, she's got the nose ring, and she just looks so cool and so intense and like just alternative and everything else. And you get a little bit of the ship's bio reading, like something that Hudson would have been seeing in Aliens. You get a nice shot of the alien menacing her, which somewhat recalls Alien 3. Everything I want to see is right there. So for me, that's my page. 2 pages before, 3 pages after, whatever. I would be happy with virtually any of these. They're all excellent. And you can see that Kelley Jones is just having a blast doing this miniseries, I feel.
Yeah, and the Hive looks cool. It looks like weird trumpets of dirt coming up from the ground. As far as his artistic license on this, he's really having fun doing alien. I mean, the weird alien gun thing. It's very a strange page, but it also reminded me of it was like if this were a movie, it would have been directed by David Cronenberg. Existenz or whatever, like these like flesh guns, and that's the kind of look that he gives even that technology. He has room to play. It's because you're not doing a straight up the movie, and it does have a central premise that is unusual and new and still plays with the same box of toys that everybody gets to play with. But to say, okay, well, if we can make human like androids, why can't we make other life forms, and can that be programmed, and what would we do with it? I just think that once it's the damn Aliens universe where everything is mercantile, everything's got to be about money, and I get it for the villains, but you've got this piece of technology that can infiltrate a hive. Are you going in there for, I don't know, like scientific study? Like, what could we have learned about the aliens in this context? And then it all goes wrong. But the fact that they're just going for jelly, and it's just it's mercantile, or it's at least selfish, because the scientist wants it for himself because he's using it as a drug. But then, it's like, it just feels like, okay, everybody's selfish in these stories. Whereas if it had been like a different motivation, I think we might have learned more. We could have kept that alien in. Maybe he goes, like, one of the things that it seems to suggest is that he's going to go rogue, that he can lose control, that once he gets into the hive, maybe he gets turned by the queen. Maybe it's like, well, this is where I want to be. A little bit like Gil earlier in the story was going, I'm just here to do my job. I don't care about you humans. Well, what if Norbert was the same? What if he gets in the hive and goes, yeah, this is it. This is what I was made for. This is the life. And he turns against them. It's like, now you're fighting an android alien. So it just seems to set up a lot of things that don't really pay off. It's like, okay, the jelly can sort of put you in a state where every, like a second lasts an eternity, and you're seeing things in slow motion. But then when at the end, when there's a chest burster in that character's chest, and he's blissed out and he's euphoric and it's all happening. But shouldn't that be lasting an eternity, that moment? And why aren't we feeling that? Why isn't it like an ironic, like at the end, they put themselves in that trance to avoid the pain, but then it turns out that it extends the pain. And then you've got like a real poetic justice, harsh, ironic ending, which we don't get here really. So there's a lot of dropping the ball, not just for the dog, but in terms of storytelling, which I think that's what's disappointing. I think it was like driving towards a lot of interesting themes, a lot of different possible endings, and then by the fourth issue, it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So in a way, it's a good thing. Obviously, it's a good thing that Kelley Jones is on this, because we can pour over the pages and we can like the art and we can say, well, this was one of the best looking Aliens projects that we got in this era. But unfortunately, it's a little bit wasted in the way that like the story doesn't really, get there at the end.
Yeah, and I'm not one of these people that, I know there are people that just completely check out when you kill the animal. They invest immediately in the animal, you kill the animal, and it loses you. I'm not that person. But if you commit to killing the dog, you don't get to like give the humans the happy, sweet ending. Especially, if you've been tainted by the children's book that you're writing at the same time you're writing the Aliens book, then make sure you don't kill the dog, because you got to go for the super happy ending. You got to Wayne's World that. Doodly-good. You can't kill the dog and then save the humans. That's just that's not how anything of this stuff works.
Yeah,
and I agree. You want to have that messed up. Like if you're going to try to do a Grant Morrison, if you're going to try to do an Alan Moore, then you're going to have a cool twist. And the cool twist isn't, I got really stoned and I didn't even notice when the chest burster was coming out at me. That's not a twist that's going to resonate with people, I don't think.
Yeah, and I was wondering as well, you mentioned it earlier, when she gets splashed with acid blood or, something, and it seems to burn, and she goes, ah! And then there's no scar, which is surprising for Kelley Jones, who obviously is not shy about making it gory. So I'm looking at this again, and I'm like, okay, well, was she blinded? Because for a lot of the pages that follow, she kind of has a dead stare, or she's looking, I don't know, the eyes look more tired, and she's kind of looking in the void sort of thing. But by the last few pages, when all of this is going like, okay, yes, let's spend these last few seconds or eternity together. By then, she's giving side eyes. She's obviously got very animated eyes, so it's not that either. So it also feels like I wonder, was this story going somewhere, and then the plot was changed? I don't know, because it does seem like it's driving towards certain things, and then you turn left instead of right, and what's going on now? Maybe it was like impaired either by editorial, either by lack of imagination, either by Kelley Jones drawing something and then Prosser saying, nope, that's not where we're going with it, even though that the art suggests it. I don't know, but in the end, it's a little disappointing, as we said. Still, I still think this is like a very good little project from back then. Like I don't mind having bought this or having had to reread it.
One of the parts that gets me was the crash landing of the pirates. It's like they've been shot down by the Lancet, they've crashed, and we see these facial close-ups of the doctor and the lady and the robot, and it's like, oh, a ship crash? I had to get that entirely from the captions because I wasn't seeing it visually. And as you pointed out, you do your new flesh gun from Videodrome, your existence gun, and then you don't actually get to see the alien running around and blasting people until he gets torn to pieces. You want to see the fight, and just like with Genocide, you want to see the aliens versus the aliens, and that's not really what the story's about. So it sells you one story, it gives you another, and it's not like, it's a twist. It's like, oh no, you just failed to satisfy my expectations. Bad job there. Like I said, the art alone is worth the price of admission, and I love that he's not photorealistic. I think that the more you show the aliens in exacting anatomic detail, the more you demystify them, the less scary they are. And Jones, by doing these bizarre things with the bodies that aren't on model, but I'm looking at an alien and things are on this thing that I don't know what they do or why they're there. I've never seen that in any other alien before. Even with the humans, I do agree that there are a lot of humans, like the standard issue humans can be confusing, but the doctor has a robust body, yes, and he looks very different. The lady looks different. Gil looks a little bit different. The captain, there are some great facial close-ups in various panels that are extremely detailed for no good reason besides Kelley Jones just felt like doing it for that particular panel, but they're gorgeous. I just love looking at this book, and this is the story that I bought the omnibuses for. It's like I may not sit down with the big thick book and read each one of these stories ever again, or any of them really, but I do have the opportunity to crack open the book and flip through and look at these pages and just marvel at how gorgeous they are. The story's fine. It does what it needs to do. I'm here for the art, and the art completely makes it worthwhile for me.
Agreed.
And that sounds like a wrap.
It was one after another of those things. Alien, to that extent, I still would get, you think, well, people forget about that or whatever. They didn't. And even people making the movies would say that they were looking at Alien Hive. And wow, that was years ago, but if Ridley Scott's looking at it, I'm okay. Barbara Kessel, who was the lady who hired me at DC, then she was an editor at DC, to come and do Dead Man. And she had resigned from DC when I went on to do Dead Man as a prestige series, and she took a job and moved to Portland, where Dark Horse is from New York, and took up shop there. That's the reason I did Alien. She was the editor of Alien Hive. So I did those, and that went over really, really well. Those books went over very well.
Excerpt from the 1998 Aliens Harvest trade paperback, A World of People Where Monsters Lurked, by Kelley Jones, writing from Citrus Heights, California. It's a miracle to me that I ever drew Aliens Hive, now Harvest. A miracle because of the trauma I endured when I saw the original movie in 1979. I went expecting a feel-good Star Wars kind of thing. Instead, I found a real horror movie. I like horror movies. I really do. I have seen such obscure classics as Grave of the Vampire. How many people can say that? But Alien, to quote the cliche, was a real roller coaster, and I hate roller coasters. They make me vomit. Alien very nearly made me vomit. I hate vomiting just a little more than I hate roller coasters. I loved Alien though. How's that for a psychological profile? I remember sitting next to this college football lineman when I saw the film. He brought his girlfriend. He was very tough sounding, kind of frat. He kept telling her he'd protect her. He blubbered louder than anyone in the theater, and we were all pretty jumpy. I remember his girlfriend kept patting his shoulder and telling him it was just a movie. I was actually mildly comforted by her stalwart reassurances. It was dark by the time the film ended. When we got to my car, my friend and I actually looked under the car and in the back seat before we got in, for fear of a giant bug-like monster with a double set of jaws lying in wait. This is before the days of Nick at Night, so there wasn't any kind of warm, fuzzy diversion to get your mind off of your terror like there is now. You just had to lie in bed and try not to think about it. What a primal film. I never wanted to see it again. My phobia of this film rivaled my fear of math. I tried to watch it a couple of times over the next 10 years. A sort of associative therapy. I always stopped the film about 15 to 20 minutes into it. I never actually told anyone about this. I always found some excuse for backing out of a midnight film festival anytime Alien was included in the lineup. I usually used nausea as the excuse. So I had this incredible phobia no one knew about, and Barbara Kessel called me and said, "Do you want to do an Aliens miniseries?" What's it about? I stammered back. She told me she had 2 different stories in her possession and asked me to review them both and decide which one I wanted. She hung up and I sat there thinking of excuses to get out of it. I didn't think she'd buy vomiting. Considered I'd have to be sick for about the next 3 months. I thought of other excuses, prior deadlines, religious ceremonies, my mom wouldn't let me. The plots arrived a few days later, and I let them sit on my coffee table for a while. I found lots of other things to do in the meantime, but I knew Barbara would be calling sooner or later, so I sat down and read the first script. It wasn't really my cup of tea, to borrow another cliche, but I was relieved. I read the second script. I looked for any nitpicky reason why I couldn't accept. I couldn't find one. The script was fantastic. I remember being impressed with the depth of characterization. Certainly not your usual comics fare. I found myself actually caring about what happened to these characters and wondering how the story would turn out. I had drawn a lot of stories at that point and had read a great deal more, yet I had no idea where the plot was going or how it would end. That is such a rare thing. Midway through the script, I flipped to the back page to see who wrote it. I expected a big name writer, considering the quality of the story. It said, by Jerry Prosser? Who's Jerry Prosser, I wondered. I was really impressed. Here was a story that totally captured the atmosphere of the first Alien movie. A world of people where monsters lurked instead of the other way around. Jerry's story is filled with a whole range of human emotion. Love, envy, jealousy, greed, hope, and fear. Debilitating fear. This is really epitomized in the character of Stan. Jerry's youth belies his ability to write the elderly professor so sad and alone. His masterful handling of the aliens themselves really impressed me. This book, and Jerry's idea, came out long before the Jurassic Park view of monsters that do what they do, neither good nor evil, but monstrously terrifying nonetheless. I guess that pretty much cinched it for me. I had to draw this book. When Barbara finally called, I said yes before she could ask. I've always felt good about the art in this job. Les Dorshid's wonderful color schemes are as much a part of this series' success as Jerry's story or my pictures. Notice the natural lighting and outdoor scenes and the artificial quality of light inside the spaceship. Masterful. So now I can watch the Alien movie again can, even late at night, as long as my girlfriend sits up with me. She doesn't hold my hand or anything, but she does bring me coffee. I even own the special edition Laserdisc with the extra monster footage tacked to the end, but I owe it to Jerry Prosser. You could say Jerry cured me of my alien phobia. Now, if you could only do something about my math anxiety. Did you want any sort of identifier, like a military rank, or are you one of the synthetics, or what is your how do you want to come at this? If as far as crediting goes.
I don't know. What I'm Jones the cat.
Okay.
I've always been a cat person, so I don't know what you're doing with this.
You can be the monkey on the Nostromo then.
Okay.
21st Century Boys, AJ Ducky, Between the Pages blog, Bill at Spy Vinyl, Billy Hines, BotTalk.com, CH, Canoes, Chris A. Field, Otherverse Games, Chris Dunford, Chris Lydon, Dear Watchers, Marvel What If Podcast, Del Dracula, Doc Strange, Dirk Ashton, Ed Moore, History of Comics on Film, Iowa's Joe Is, Jeffrey Brown, They Them, Joe M. Sontag, John from Married Watching Cartoons and Transformers The Real Pod, Kirk Spencer, Demented Old Circus Monkey, Lamar the Revenger, Mark Wilkins, Mike at Reanimike, Mike at Send Aliens to Me, Randy Caldwell, Richard Field, Richard Dent, Ryan Daly, Siskoid, Star Trek Gay, Tomascari, Wayne Burrows, and Wonder Woman Warrior for Peace podcast. Randy Caldwell added, of course I read the title line as Dark Side Presents Aliens. I am still waking up.
This has been a Rolled Spine podcast. All audio samples are believed covered under fair use laws. No copyright infringement is intended.
Coming in April, Alien 3. With guest Derek William Crabb.